Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a completely impartial deep dive into the source material of one of the most famous, heavily documented paranormal cases in history. We're setting up a true detective-style investigation into the bizarre events that kicked off in a North London suburb back in the late summer of 1977. We're talking about the Enfield Poltergeist. Was it an unsolved mystery, or was it just an incredibly elaborate hoax? Now, our goal here isn't to tell you what to believe. We're just going to lay out the documented evidence, the eyewitness testimonies, and the rigorous scientific scrutiny of the time, all structured clearly so we can examine it together. Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to picture the scene. It's September 1st, 1977, and WPC Caroline Heaps, a highly credible on-duty police officer, is called out to 284 Green Street. She's standing in the dark living room of the frightened Hodgson family home, and she testifies, "I saw the chair slide across the floor. At no time did it appear to leave the floor." Now, she immediately checked that chair, right? And she found absolutely nothing to explain how it moved. When you have a trained, objective observer like a police officer documenting something like this, it instantly sets a completely different tone for the investigation. This was the terrifying, inciting incident that brought external, official eyes onto a very scared family. To really grasp the gravity of this case, we've got to look at the timeline, because this wasn't some slow, creeping build. Actually, it was an absolute explosion of activity. It starts somewhat quietly in late August 77. The kids hear some shuffling, some knocking in their bedroom. But then, bam, September 1st, the police are there and witness a chair moving by itself. Just 3 days later, on September 4th, it becomes a national media circus. A photographer from the Daily Mirror visits and gets hit square in the forehead by a flying piece of Lego traveling at high speed. And literally the next day, Maurice Gross from the Society for Psychical Research shows up. In just one single week, a family's private fear completely spiraled into chaos. That sheer speed of escalation is a really critical piece of the source material. Part 1. Escalating Paranormal Phenomena. Cataloging the Bizarre. And this brilliantly illustrates just how overwhelming the claims actually were. We're not just talking about a couple of bumps in the night here. According to the records, investigators, reporters, and the family were documenting crazy stuff. Marbles and Legos flying through the air and just landing without rolling at all. Metal spoons bending. Heavy toilet doors swinging open and shut completely on their own. And, maybe the most famous claim, 11-year-old Janet levitating and being dropped in different spots. The physical force even escalated until a heavy iron fireplace was physically wrenched away from the wall. The sheer variety and violence of these phenomena is just staggering. And remember, these weren't just claims made behind closed doors. A lot of this was seen firsthand by totally independent observers. Take Hazel Short, for instance. She was the local lollipop lady, a school crossing guard. She had absolutely no personal ties to the Hodgsons. She was just standing out on the street looking at the house. And she said, "I definitely saw her come up about window height, as if someone had got hold of her legs and back and was throwing her." She and a friend both claimed they saw Janet bouncing horizontally in the air, way higher than she could have just jumped from a bed, hitting the window with serious force. When external public witnesses report impossible physical events like that, well, it deeply complicates the idea that this was just some simple, contained family prank. Part 2. Methods of investigation. Applying science to the supernatural. So, how do you even begin to investigate claims of this magnitude? Well, researchers Maurice Gross and Guy Playfair didn't just casually observe, they practically moved in. We're talking over 180 visits and 25 all-night vigils. But they also brought in hard science. Physicist John Hosted from Birkbeck College brought over this specialized Blundell couch to measure weight anomalies. When they strapped Janet to it, Hasted recorded these sudden, totally unexplainable 1 kilogram weight increases. They'd spike, then gradually go back to normal. They were actively trying to ground this bizarre stuff in measurable physical science, looking for hard data instead of just spooky stories. But then, December 1977 hits, and we get the most shocking escalation of the entire case. A harsh, guttural, elderly man's voice starts speaking directly through 12-year-old Janet, and it identifies itself as Bill Wilkins. This wasn't just a few random grunts. This voice swore habitually, had full-on conversations, and sounded absolutely nothing like a preteen girl. Investigators were super suspicious, obviously, so to test it, Maurice Gross actually taped Janet's mouth shut. Later on, he even filled her mouth with water. But incredibly, the voice just kept coming.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the scientific explanation proposed by phonetics expert Adrian Forson. He tested Janet and suggested the voice could be produced by a physiological condition called plica ventricularis. Basically, it's where muscle tension in your throat produces sounds completely independent of your vocal cords, creating this weird, deep bass tone. However, and this is a massive however in the source text, this condition usually causes severe hoarseness and a very sore throat after just a short time. But Janet, she produced this grueling voice for hours on end and exhibited absolutely none of those expected side effects.
And then you have to look at what the voice actually said. Listen to this chilling quote from Bill Wilkins during an interrogation by the investigators. "I went blind and I had a hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died on a chair in the corner downstairs." Here is the deeply unsettling fact they found out. The previous occupant of that exact house was indeed a man named Mr. Wilkins, and years later his son confirmed that he had died in that exact house under those highly specific medical circumstances. It was this intimate piece of history that a young girl like Janet seemingly had no logical way of knowing.
Part 3. Controversy and skepticism, the debunkers push back. Of course, with claims this extraordinary, the pushback from professional debunkers was fiercely intense. Looking at both sides completely neutrally, it's quite the debate. On the believers' side, you've got Gross and Playfair waving their 180 hours of audio tape, pointing to multiple credible witnesses, including cops and physicists, and highlighting physical anomalies that just flatly defied explanation. But on the skeptic side, investigators like Anita Gregory and Melvin Harris argued forcefully that the girls were just play acting. They claimed the deep voice was a learned trick for attention, and they said the famous photographs didn't show paranormal levitation, but just young girls having some spirited hijinks by jumping off their beds. The media debate got incredibly polarized. But there's an important nuance even within that skepticism. Take Daily Mirror reporter George Fallows, who spent a lot of time observing the house. He wrote, "To the best of our ability, we have eliminated the possibility of total trickery. In my opinion, this faking could only be done by an expert." That is a critical layer to all this. Even the people who suspected some fakery had to admit that pulling off the sheer variety, speed, and complexity of these illusions right in front of watchful investigators would take expert-level trickery. It wasn't just simple child's play. Let's move to and see how this builds to a massive narrative twist encapsulated by just a single number: 2%. Years later, as an adult, Janet made this huge admission that threw a serious wrench into the whole story. She told a journalist that, yes, she and her sister did actually fake some of the events, but she claimed they only cheated about 2% of the time. Why? Because they felt immense pressure from the constant watching by investigators and journalists who were always waiting for something to happen. Still, she staunchly maintained that the other 98% of what went down in that house was entirely real, unexplainable, and terrifying. Part 4. The Enduring Legacy, Pop Culture, and Unanswered Questions. So, the crucial point is, whether you lean toward a hoax or the paranormal, the Enfield case remains the absolute blueprint for modern haunting stories. Its cultural footprint is just massive. I mean, it directly inspired Steven Spielberg's iconic movie Poltergeist, it was adapted into the gripping miniseries The Enfield Haunting, and it was heavily modeled in the infamous 1992 BBC drama Ghostwatch, which terrified a whole nation, by the way. It continues to captivate us exactly because the debate was never definitively settled. It just sits there, perfectly on the razor's edge of the unexplained. Which brings us to our final, provocative question. Does a 2% admission of trickery invalidate a mountain of witness testimony from police officers, scientists, and independent bystanders? Or does that 2% admission crack the foundation, suggesting that if they faked some of it, they could have easily faked the whole thing? We've laid out the source material for you today. The timelines, the science, the quotes, and the heavy skepticism. Now, it's entirely up to you to explore the evidence, weigh the testimonies, and decide for yourself what really happened at 284 Green Street. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.